Hello there, and welcome. Tonight we step gently into one of the most talked about mysteries in Victorian history, the unsolved case of Jack the Ripper. This is not a story told for shock, it is a story told for understanding, because behind the sensational name there is a real place, a real period of history, and real people whose lives deserve to be remembered as more than a headline. We will walk slowly through the streets of Whitechapel as they actually were, through the investigation as it actually unfolded, through the newspapers that shaped how the world saw it, and through the many theories that still circle the case more than a century later. You do not need to know anything about this history already. Curiosity is enough to carry you forward. If these slow journeys help you unwind, you are welcome to like, subscribe, or leave a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. For now, let the day loosen its grip. Let your breathing slow. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight. Let's begin. The murders took place in the autumn of 1888 in the East End district of Whitechapel. Whitechapel sat just outside the old boundary of the City of London, and by the late 19th century it had become one of the most overcrowded and impoverished districts in the entire British capital. Where the City of London represented banking, empire, and enormous wealth, Whitechapel represented almost the exact opposite, a place where thousands of people lived in conditions that horrified even contemporary observers, who were not easily horrified by poverty. The area's population had grown extremely quickly in the preceding decades. Industrialization had drawn workers into London from the countryside in search of employment, and waves of immigration, particularly from Ireland, and, later in the century, from Eastern Europe, added further pressure to a district that had never been built to hold so many people. Housing simply could not keep pace with demand, and the result was severe overcrowding and aging, poorly maintained buildings that had often been subdivided again and again to squeeze in more tenants. Common lodging houses were one of the defining features of the district. For a few pence a night, a person without a permanent home could rent a bed in a shared dormitory room, sometimes alongside dozens of strangers. These lodging houses were not romanticized flopehouses in the way later fiction sometimes portrays them. They were genuinely difficult places, cramped, often unsanitary, and populated by people living on the very edge of subsistence, moving in and out depending on whether they had managed to earn enough that day to pay for a bed. Whitechapel's economy relied heavily on casual and seasonal labour. Dockwork, market labour, and small-scale manufacturing, particularly in the clothing trade, employed large numbers of residents on an irregular day-to-day basis. This meant that even people who were nominally employed could face weeks of little or no income, and the line between working poverty and outright destitution was thin and constantly shifting for a huge portion of the district's population. Alcohol played a significant and complicated role in the life of the district. Public houses were among the most affordable forms of warmth, light, and company available to people living in cramped, cold lodgings, and they served as informal community centres as much as drinking establishments. At the same time, contemporary social reformers frequently, and sometimes unfairly, blamed alcohol as the primary cause of the poverty around them, rather than recognizing the poverty itself as the underlying condition driving people toward whatever relief they could find. The district had a significant Jewish immigrant population by the 1880s, many of whom had fled persecution and economic hardship in the Russian Empire. This community brought its own institutions, synagogues, tailoring workshops, and mutual aid societies, and it would later become, unfairly and without evidence, a target of suspicion and prejudice during the panic surrounding the murders, a pattern of scapegoating that reflected existing tensions in the district rather than anything connected to the actual case. Journalists and social investigators had already begun turning their attention to the East End before the murders began. Writers such as Charles Booth were in the process of conducting detailed social surveys of London poverty, mapping streets by income and condition in a project that would eventually produce some of the most valuable primary sources historians have for understanding exactly how people in districts like Whitechapel actually lived during this period. It is worth being direct about who the 5 women most widely accepted as the canonical victims of the case actually were, because history has too often reduced them to a list of injuries rather than remembering them as people. Their names were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Each of them had a life, a history and circumstances that led them to Whitechapel streets on the nights they died, and each deserves to be spoken of with that basic dignity intact. Mary Ann Nichols, generally known as Polly, was found in the early hours of the 31st of August 1888 in Bucks Row. She was around 43 years old at the time of her death. Records show a life marked by a difficult marriage that had ended some years earlier, periods spent in workhouses, and the kind of unstable, itinerant existence that was common among London's poorest residents during this period. She is generally regarded by historians as the first of the canonical victims. Annie Chapman was found on the 8th of September 1888 in the yard behind a house on Hanbury Street. She was in her mid-40s. Chapman had also experienced a marriage that broke down, and by 1888 she was living an unsettled life, moving between lodging houses, dealing with poor health, and, like many women in her situation, sometimes turning to street solicitation as a means of survival when other income was not available. Elizabeth Stride, sometimes known by the nickname Long Liz, was found on the 30th of September 1888 in Dutfield's yard off Berner Street. She was in her mid-40s and had emigrated to London from Sweden as a young woman. Her life included a period working in domestic service, a marriage, and, in her later years, financial hardship that led her into the same precarious world of lodging houses and casual survival that characterized so much of Whitechapel life. Catherine Eddowes was found later the same night as Stride in Mitre Square, in the adjoining district of the City of London, a discovery that placed the investigation directly at the boundary between 2 separate police jurisdictions. Eddowes was 46 years old. She had spent time in a relationship that produced children, had travelled and worked in various casual occupations, and had, like the other women, ended up in the world of common lodging houses by 1888. Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest of the 5 canonical victims, at around 25 years old, was found on the 9th of November 1888 inside her rented room at Miller's Court, a small property off Dorset Street. Kelly's death occurred indoors rather than in the street, which meant the crime scene was considerably more private, and by most accounts the injuries inflicted were the most severe of the entire series, reflecting the fact that the killer had far more time and privacy than in any of the previous attacks. Because Kelly's murder took place indoors and out of public view for a longer period before discovery, it is generally regarded by historians and criminologists as representing an escalation in the killer's behavior, though the precise reasons for that escalation, along with almost everything else about the killer's identity and motive, remain unknown to this day. The murders shared certain broad characteristics that led investigators and the press to link them together as the work of a single individual. Each victim was a woman working in precarious circumstances in the Whitechapel area. Each death involved a similar pattern of violence directed at the throat and abdomen, and each occurred within a relatively compact geographic area over a period of a few months in the latter half of 1888. It is worth noting, and responsible modern historians consistently emphasize this point, that the exact number of murders attributable to a single perpetrator has never been definitively settled. The 5 canonical murders represent the cases most widely agreed upon by researchers. But Whitechapel in this period saw other violent deaths of women that some researchers have argued may or may not belong to the same series, a genuine and ongoing point of scholarly disagreement rather than a settled fact. The murders occurred within the jurisdiction of 2 separate police forces, the Metropolitan Police, which covered most of London, including most of Whitechapel, and the City of London Police, which covered the small historically distinct area known as the City, where the Eddiles murder took place. This jurisdictional division created genuine practical difficulties for coordinating the investigation, since the 2 forces operated with separate command structures and did not always share information as efficiently as a single unified investigation would have allowed. The Metropolitan Police assigned a significant number of officers to the case, including detectives from the Criminal Investigation Department, and the investigation is now recognized by historians of policing as one of the largest and most intensive manhunts conducted in Britain up to that point in history, involving extensive door-to-door inquiries, interviews with residents, and the examination of a large number of individuals who came under suspicion for various reasons over the following months. Forensic science, in the sense we understand it today, was still in its infancy in 1888. Fingerprint identification was not yet in use by British police. Blood typing did not exist, and the kind of detailed forensic pathology that later crime scene investigation would rely on was limited to basic medical examination by attending physicians whose findings, while useful, could not provide the kind of definitive evidence that later forensic techniques would make possible. Dr. Thomas Bond, a police surgeon consulted on the case, produced what is now regarded by many criminologists as one of the earliest documented examples of an offender profile, a written assessment attempting to describe the likely psychological characteristics, physical strength, and possible occupation of the killer based on the pattern of injuries observed across the murders. This document is considered historically significant as an early precursor to modern criminal profiling techniques. The press coverage of the murders was extensive, often sensationalized, and played a major role in shaping public perception of both the case and the district of Whitechapel itself. Newspaper circulation in London was highly competitive by the late 1880s, and the murders, along with the mysterious unidentified killer behind them, provided exactly the kind of ongoing dramatic story that sold papers issue after issue after issue. The name Jack the Ripper itself originated from a letter sent to a news agency in late September 1888, purporting to be from the killer. The letter was signed with that name, and once it was published, the name spread rapidly through the press and quickly became the fixed public identity attached to the case, regardless of whether the letter itself was genuinely written by the perpetrator, a question that remains unresolved and that most researchers today consider likely to have been a hoax written by a journalist seeking to sensationalize the story further. A second letter, generally referred to by researchers as the Saucy Jackie postcard, followed shortly afterward and referenced details of the murders in a way that some contemporaries believed suggested genuine knowledge of the crimes, while others considered it, like the first letter, an opportunistic fabrication designed to capitalize on public fascination with the case. The further piece of correspondence, known as the From Hell letter, was sent to a local Whitechapel official in October 1888, and this letter is treated somewhat differently by researchers, since it arrived alongside a preserved biological specimen described in contemporary accounts, leading some historians to consider it, while still not conclusively verified, at least a somewhat more plausible candidate for genuine communication from the perpetrator than the earlier letters, though this remains a matter of ongoing debate rather than settled fact. In total, Police in the period received hundreds of letters claiming to be from the killer, the overwhelming majority of which are now regarded by historians as hoaxes, sent by members of the public caught up in the sensational atmosphere the case had created, along with a smaller number sent by people seeking attention or attempting, for various reasons, to mislead the investigation. Public anxiety in Whitechapel during the autumn of 1888 was considerable, and it manifested in several organised ways beyond simple fear. Local residents formed vigilance committees, organised groups of men who patrolled the streets at night in an attempt to provide additional security in a district where confidence in police protection had been badly shaken by the ongoing, unsolved murders. One such group, the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, became particularly well known, and its members included local shopkeepers and business owners who had both a personal stake in restoring a sense of safety to the district and a practical business interest in reversing the negative attention the murders had brought to the area's reputation. Reward money was offered by various private individuals and organisations during the investigation, though the Metropolitan Police itself, following its established general policy at the time, generally declined to offer official rewards, a decision that drew criticism from parts of the public and press who felt the force was not doing everything possible to encourage information that might lead to an arrest. The murders occurred against a backdrop of significant social and political tension in London more broadly. The year 1888 followed closely on the heels of considerable labour unrest, including the Match Girls' strike of 1888 itself, and broader movements around workers' rights and conditions, meaning that public and press attention to the East End was already unusually high even before the murders began, for reasons connected to poverty, labour conditions, and social reform, rather than crime specifically. The murders also intersected with a wave of social reporting on East End poverty that had been building for several years. Journalist and social investigator organisations, along with individual campaigners, had already been publishing detailed accounts of overcrowding, poor housing, and destitution in districts like Whitechapel, and the murders tragically brought a far larger and more sustained level of national attention to these conditions than years of prior reform-minded journalism had managed to achieve on its own. Some historians have argued that the intense public attention generated by the murders indirectly contributed to genuine improvements in housing and sanitary conditions in parts of the East End in the years that followed, as the sheer scale of press coverage forced local authorities and philanthropic housing organisations to confront conditions that had previously received comparatively little sustained national attention. Suspicion during the investigation fell on a very wide range of individuals, reflecting both genuine investigative leads and, in a significant number of cases, the prejudices of the period. Members of the local immigrant Jewish community faced particular and unjustified suspicion at various points during the panic, a pattern that reflected existing anti-Semitic sentiment in parts of London society rather than any evidence connecting any specific individual within that community to the crimes. A graffiti message found near the site of the Eddowes murder, commonly referred to by researchers as the Golston Street graffito, became a significant point of controversy at the time. The message's exact wording, its relationship to the crimes, and the decision by the police official on the scene to have it erased before it could be photographed, out of concern that it might incite anti-Jewish violence in an already tense district, remain debated by historians to this day. Among the suspects who have been proposed over the decades by various researchers, journalists, and amateur investigators, a number of names recur most frequently in serious historical discussion of the case. It is worth being clear from the outset that none of these theories has ever been proven to the standard that would satisfy a modern criminal investigation, and the case remains, by any honest accounting, formally unsolved. Montague John Druitt, a barrister and teacher who died by suicide shortly after the final canonical murder, was proposed as a suspect in private police correspondence written some years after the case, though the surviving evidence connecting him to the murders is largely circumstantial, and the theory has been extensively challenged by later researchers who have found significant problems with the timeline and evidence originally used to support it. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant living in the Whitechapel area who was known to have experienced significant mental illness, was named in police documents from the period as a suspect considered by some officers investigating the case. Interest in Kosminski as a suspect has continued into recent decades, including disputed forensic analysis conducted on preserved evidence, though the scientific validity and chain of custody of that later evidence has been challenged by other researchers, and the theory remains contested rather than conclusively established. Michael Ostrog, a career criminal with a documented history of fraud and theft, was also named as a suspect in period police records, though later research into his actual movements and circumstances during the period of the murders has led many modern historians to consider him one of the less plausible suspects among those named in contemporary documents. Francis Tumblety, an American traveling quack doctor with a documented history of eccentric and sometimes disturbing behavior, has been proposed as a suspect based on later discovered correspondence from a period police official expressing suspicion of him. His departure from Britain during the relevant period, and questions about the reliability of the surviving evidence connecting him to the case, have made him a figure of ongoing but unresolved interest among researchers. Beyond these figures drawn from the historical police record, a very large number of additional suspects have been proposed by later writers and researchers over the more than a century since the murders took place, ranging from other local labourers and criminals to, at the more speculative end of the spectrum, prominent public figures whose connection to the case rests on evidence that professional historians generally regard as thin or entirely unsupported. It is worth being candid about a broader pattern in the case's history. The genuine scarcity of reliable physical evidence, combined with the enormous and sustained public fascination the case has generated over the decades, has created fertile ground for theories of widely varying quality, and part of engaging responsibly with this history involves being honest about which claims rest on solid documentary evidence and which rest primarily on speculation, however entertaining that speculation might be. The investigation formally continued for years after the final canonical murder in November 1888, though active police resources devoted specifically to the case gradually diminished over time as no further murders matching the established pattern occurred and as leads were exhausted without producing an arrest. The case was never formally closed in the sense of being solved, and it remains in the official historical record an unsolved series of murders. The reasons the murders appear to have stopped after November 1888 have themselves become a subject of historical speculation. Possible explanations proposed by various researchers over the years include the death, imprisonment, institutionalization, or emigration of the perpetrator, though none of these explanations can be confirmed without knowing the killer's identity, which remains unknown. The physical geography of Whitechapel itself played a significant role in the investigation's difficulty. The district's dense network of narrow streets, courts and alleys, many of them poorly lit even by the standards of the period, made it comparatively easy for someone to move unseen between public thoroughfares and secluded spaces, a characteristic of the built environment that several contemporary police officials specifically noted as a significant obstacle to surveillance and pursuit. Gas lighting in the district was inconsistent, with some main streets reasonably well lit, while smaller courts and alleyways, including several of the locations connected to the murders, remained considerably darker, a detail that street lighting reform advocates specifically cited in the aftermath of the murders as an area requiring improvement. The Metropolitan Police Force itself was still a relatively young institution in 1888, having been established earlier in the century, and the Whitechapel murders occurred during a period when public confidence in policing was already under considerable strain, partly due to controversies connected to the force's handling of earlier public order events in London, meaning the murders arrived at a moment when the institution's credibility was already a subject of public debate. Sir Charles Warren, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police during the period of the murders, faced significant public and press criticism over the handling of the investigation, and his decision to order the erasure of the Gulston Street graffito in particular drew sustained criticism at the time. Warren resigned from his position shortly after the final canonical murder, though historians generally note that his resignation stemmed from a combination of factors beyond the Ripper investigation alone, including broader disputes within the Home Office over police authority and policy. The medical examinations conducted on the victims were carried out by several different police surgeons over the course of the investigation, and their detailed reports, preserved in official records, remain one of the primary sources historians rely on for understanding the specifics of each case, alongside contemporary newspaper accounts and official inquest testimony. Coroner's inquests were held for each victim, as was standard legal procedure for unexplained deaths in this period, and the surviving transcripts of witness testimony from these inquests provide historians with valuable detail about the victims' final movements, the circumstances of discovery, and the observations of local residents, and in several cases witnesses who reported seeing the victims and the unidentified man shortly before their deaths. Witness testimony regarding the possible appearance of the perpetrator vary considerably between accounts, a common feature of eyewitness evidence generally, and no single consistent physical description, emerge from the case that later researchers have been able to treat as definitively reliable, contributing significantly to the enduring uncertainty around the killer's identity. The murders took place within a compact area of less than 1 square mile, a detail that has struck many later researchers as significant, suggesting a perpetrator with intimate familiarity with the specific streets, courts, and alleys of the district, whether through residence, employment, or simply extensive time spent in the area prior to the murders. Public fascination with the case extended well beyond London itself during the period of the murders, with newspapers across Britain and, before long, internationally, covering the story extensively, making Jack the Ripper one of the first criminal cases to receive what could reasonably be described as genuinely global media attention, a significant development in the history of crime reporting more broadly. The murders and the surrounding press coverage contributed to lasting changes in how London, and Whitechapel specifically, was perceived by the wider public, cementing an association between the district and crime, poverty, and danger that persisted in popular imagination for many decades afterward, an association that some historians argue oversimplified and stigmatized a community that was, in reality, far more complex and resilient than its sensationalized reputation suggested. Whitechapel's own residents, it is worth remembering, were themselves the primary community affected by the murders, living with genuine fear during the autumn of 1888, while also, in many cases, resenting the way sensationalized outside press coverage portrayed their neighborhood and its residents in broad, unflattering strokes that did not reflect the ordinary, difficult, resilient lives most people in the district were actually living. The case has generated an enormous body of subsequent research, writing and theorizing over the more than a century since the murders occurred, a field sometimes referred to informally as Ripperology, encompassing both serious historical scholarship drawing on archival research, and alongside it, a considerable volume of more speculative and sometimes unreliable material aimed at a popular audience. Serious historians working on the case generally emphasize the importance of relying on primary source documents, contemporary police records, inquest testimony, and verified newspaper reporting, rather than later, unverified claims that have sometimes been introduced into the popular narrative of the case without solid documentary support. The case has also become a significant subject in the modern tourism industry, with guided walking tours of the Whitechapel area remaining a popular attraction, though this has itself become a subject of some debate, with critics arguing that certain commercial approaches to presenting the case risk sensationalizing violence against women rather than engaging thoughtfully with the genuine social history of the period. A museum dedicated to the case operated for a period in the area, and its opening drew significant local controversy, since it had originally been proposed to the relevant planning authorities as a museum focused on women's history in the East End, a change in stated purpose that many local residents and campaigners felt was both a bait and switch and a missed opportunity to centre the actual social history of the district's working women rather than the unidentified killer. The victims' individual stories have, in recent decades, received renewed and more careful historical attention from researchers specifically seeking to move the narrative away from a sole focus on the killer and toward a fuller understanding of who these 5 women actually were, drawing on census records, workhouse records, and other archival sources to reconstruct their lives with greater depth and accuracy than earlier popular accounts of the case typically provided. This renewed research has revealed, among other things, that the popular assumption, repeated for many decades, that all 5 canonical victims worked exclusively and continuously as sex workers oversimplifies what the documentary evidence actually shows about their varied and often shifting circumstances, which for several of the women involved periods of more conventional employment, domestic work and family life alongside periods of more conventional employment, domestic work and family life alongside periods of greater hardship. The case sits at an interesting intersection of criminal history and social history more broadly, since understanding it properly requires engaging not only with the specific details of the murders and investigation, but also with the broader conditions of poverty, housing, immigration, gender, and class that shaped daily life in Whitechapel during this period of London's history. Victorian London in the 1880s was a city of stark contrasts, with tremendous wealth concentrated in some districts existing only a short distance from severe poverty in others, and Whitechapel's proximity to the financial wealth of the City of London made this contrast especially visible and, to contemporary social reformers, especially troubling. Period saw a growing movement of philanthropic housing reform, with organisations working to replace some of the district's worst slum housing with newly constructed model dwellings, intended to provide healthier, more sanitary living conditions for working-class residents, though the scale of this reform remained limited relative to the overall scale of the district's housing problems throughout this period. Workhouses played a significant role in the lives of many of Whitechapel's poorest residents, including, as historical records show, several of the case's victims at various points in their lives. These institutions, established under poor law legislation, provided basic shelter and food in exchange for labour under conditions that were deliberately kept harsh in accordance with the prevailing social policy philosophy of the period, which held that conditions should be worse than the lowest available paid employment in order to discourage reliance on public relief. The role of women in Victorian working-class London more broadly involved navigating an economy that offered relatively few stable, well-paid opportunities for women without family support or formal training, a structural reality that historians point to as essential context for understanding the precarious circumstances many women in districts like Whitechapel found themselves in during this period. Public health conditions in Whitechapel during this period were generally poor, reflecting overcrowding, inadequate sanitation infrastructure in older buildings, and limited access to clean water in some of the district's poorest streets, conditions that contributed to significant rates of infectious disease and generally lower life expectancy compared to wealthier districts of London during the same period. The murders occurred only a few years after significant public health legislation had begun to reshape London's infrastructure more broadly, including major sewer construction projects completed in earlier decades, though the benefits of this broader infrastructure investment had not been evenly distributed across all districts, and areas like Whitechapel continue to lag behind wealthier parts of the city in terms of sanitary conditions well into the period of the murders. Religious and charitable organizations maintained a significant presence in Whitechapel during this period, operating missions, soup kitchens, and other forms of practical assistance aimed at the district's poorest residents, reflecting a broader Victorian tradition of organized philanthropy that operated alongside, and sometimes in tension with, more systemic calls for structural social and economic reform. The murders took place during a period of significant immigration into the East End, and the district's demographic composition was shifting notably during the very years the murders occurred, with a substantial and growing Jewish immigrant population settling in Whitechapel specifically, a demographic reality that, as noted earlier, unfortunately became entangled with unfounded suspicion during the panic surrounding the case. Trade and small-scale manufacturing, particularly in the garment industry, employed significant numbers of Whitechapel residents, often under conditions historians now recognize as reflecting what was, in effect, an early and largely unregulated version of what would later be termed sweatshop labor, with long hours, low pay, and minimal worker protections characterizing much of this employment sector during the period. The murders and their surrounding social context contributed, in the years that followed, to increased attention from social reformers, journalists, and eventually policymakers toward the specific conditions facing working women in London's poorest districts, part of a broader, gradual shift in British social policy thinking that continued to develop over subsequent decades. It is worth noting that the murders occurred during the same general period as significant developments in British labour organising more broadly, and while the connection between the murders themselves and these labour movements is primarily one of shared historical timing and geography rather than direct causation, historians studying this period often examine both developments together as reflecting the same underlying social tensions present in London's East End during the late 1880s. The case has, over the decades, generated an enormous volume of creative work beyond straightforward historical research, including novels, films, stage productions, and other creative interpretations, reflecting the case's unusual and lasting hold on popular imagination, a hold that historians generally attribute to the combination of genuine unsolved mystery, vivid Victorian setting, and the broader cultural fascination with unidentified perpetrators that this case, more than perhaps any other historical crime, helped establish as a recognizable genre in its own right. This enduring fascination has itself become a subject of academic study, with historians and cultural scholars examining why this particular unsolved case, among many unsolved crimes throughout history, achieved such a uniquely lasting cultural presence, with explanations generally pointing to a combination of factors including the case's early and extensive press coverage, the evocative Victorian London setting, and the way the case coincided with, and in some ways helped shape, the emergence of detective fiction as a popular literary genre during the same general period. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories, it is worth noting, were being published during this very period, with the character's first appearance occurring the year before the murders began, meaning the Ripper case unfolded against a cultural backdrop already primed for public fascination with detective reasoning and the pursuit of an elusive, intelligent criminal, even though, unlike in Conan Doyle's fiction, the real investigation never achieved a resolution. Modern criminology and forensic science have advanced enormously since 1888, and this has led some later researchers to attempt applying modern investigative techniques retrospectively to the surviving historical evidence from the case, though the passage of well over a century, combined with significant gaps and uncertainties in the surviving physical evidence and its chain of custody, means that any conclusions drawn from such retrospective analysis remain, at best, suggestive rather than definitively conclusive. The case remains formally listed among Britain's unsolved historical murders, and no consensus has ever been reached among professional historians, criminologists, or law enforcement researchers regarding the killer's identity, despite the enormous volume of research, theorizing, and popular writing the case has generated over more than a century. Contemporary approaches to discussing the case increasingly emphasize centering the humanity and individual histories of the 5 women whose deaths defined it, treating them as people with names, families, and life stories, rather than reducing their memory to a supporting role in the mystery of an unidentified perpetrator, a shift in approach that reflects broader and welcome developments in how historians and journalists think about representing victims of violent crime more generally. Mary Ann Nichols' records show had been married for a number of years and had several children before her marriage broke down, after which she experienced a difficult period moving between various forms of temporary accommodation, a pattern of life shared, in broad outline, by a significant number of women in her general social circumstances during this period of London history. Annie Chapman had also been married and had children, and surviving records suggest a life marked by periods of both relative stability and significant hardship, including health difficulties in the years before her death, painting a picture of a woman navigating genuinely difficult circumstances with limited institutional support available to her. Elizabeth Stride's early life in Sweden, her emigration to London, and her subsequent years working in domestic service before her later hardship reflect a broader pattern of immigration and economic precarity that shaped the lives of many women in Victorian London who had come to the city, as she had, seeking better opportunities than were available to them elsewhere. Catherine Eddowes maintained relationships with family members throughout much of her life, including her children, and surviving accounts from people who knew her generally describe her as an intelligent and lively person, details that, again, humanize a woman whose historical memory has too often been reduced to the circumstances of her death rather than the fuller shape of her life. Mary Jane Kelly's earlier life remains, according to most historians studying the case, somewhat less clearly documented than that of the other 4 canonical victims, with various details recorded during the period, sometimes conflicting with one another, a reflection of the genuine limitations of the historical record for a young woman who, unlike some of the others, had not generated as extensive a paper trail through decades of prior residence, marriage records, or workhouse admissions. Before her death, the inquests into each victim's death drew testimony from friends, acquaintances, and fellow lodging house residents, whose accounts, preserved in the surviving records, offer historians some of the clearest available glimpses into the everyday texture of these women's lives, their friendships, their struggles, and their small moments of ordinary human connection amid genuinely difficult circumstances. The broader historical significance of the case, beyond the specific question of the killer's unresolved identity, lies substantially in what it reveals about Victorian London more generally, offering historians a uniquely well-documented window into the conditions of poverty, policing, press culture, and social attitudes of a specific place and moment in British history, precisely because the intensity of contemporary attention to the case generated an unusually detailed documentary record that has proven valuable for understanding far more than the murders themselves. Contemporary press coverage of the murders, preserved extensively in newspaper archives, has become an important primary source for historians studying the development of tabloid and sensationalist journalism in Britain, since the case is often cited as a significant early example of a crime story driving substantial and sustained newspaper circulation increases, a pattern that would become increasingly familiar in later decades of press history. The competitive newspaper environment of the 1880s London meant that different publications often took notably different editorial approaches to covering the case, with some papers focusing heavily on sensational detail intended to drive sales, while others, particularly those associated with the social reform movement of the period, used the extensive public attention the case generated has an opportunity to draw sustained focus toward the underlying conditions of poverty in Whitechapel. The case also intersects with the history of policing reform in Britain more broadly, since the investigation's ultimately unsuccessful outcome, combined with the intense public and press scrutiny it received, contributed to ongoing conversations within British policing institutions during this period about investigative methods, forensic capability, and the coordination challenges created by having separate police forces operating in adjoining jurisdictions within the same city. Some of the specific investigative and administrative challenges highlighted by the case, including the difficulties created by the divided jurisdiction between the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police, contributed to broader institutional conversations about policing coordination that continue to develop gradually over subsequent decades of British law enforcement history. The case has also been studied by historians of gender and social history specifically for what it reveals about Victorian attitudes toward women, poverty, and moral judgment, since contemporary press coverage frequently reflected and reinforced particular period assumptions about the women involved, assumptions that later historians have worked to critically examine and, where the documentary evidence supports doing so, correct. Modern historical scholarship on the case increasingly draws on a wider range of archival sources than earlier popular accounts typically relied upon, including census records, workhouse admission and discharge registers, parish records, and other bureaucratic documentation that, while not glamorous, provides historians with much more reliable detail about the actual circumstances of the victims' lives press coverage of the period alone could offer. The physical locations connected to the murders have themselves changed enormously since 1888, with significant redevelopment of the Whitechapel area occurring across the 20th century, meaning that very few of the specific buildings and streets directly associated with the case survive in anything resembling their original form today, a detail that presents genuine challenges for historians and heritage researchers seeking to accurately document and preserve the physical historical record connected to the case. Despite this physical transformation of the district, Whitechapel today remains a recognisably distinct part of London, having gone through further waves of immigration and demographic change across the 20th and 21st centuries, including significant Bangladeshi immigration in more recent decades, meaning the area's long history as a point of arrival and settlement for newcomers to London has, in a broader sense, continued well beyond the period of the murders themselves. The case continues to attract new archival research even in recent years, with historians periodically uncovering additional documentary material in police archives, newspaper collections, and other historical records that, while rarely resolving the central mystery of the killer's identity, continue to add depth and nuance to our understanding of the broader historical context in which the murders occurred. Academic historians studying the case generally caution against treating popular theories about the killer's identity as more settled than the actual surviving evidence supports, noting that the genuine scarcity of reliable forensic and documentary evidence from 1888 means that, barring some currently unknown future discovery, the case is likely to remain formally unsolved, a conclusion that, while unsatisfying to those seeking definitive answers, reflects an honest assessment of what the paintalve historical record actually allows us to know with confidence. It is this very quality of enduring, genuine uncertainty that has arguably contributed to the case's unusual staying power in public imagination, since, unlike many historical crimes that were eventually solved, either at the time or through later investigation, the Whitechapel murders remain, more than a century later, a case where the central question, who committed these crimes, has simply never received a definitive answer supported by solid historical evidence. What we can say with confidence, drawing on the substantial and carefully documented historical record that does survive, is a great deal about the world in which these murders occurred, the conditions of poverty and precarity that shaped life in Whitechapel during this period, the real names and, where the record allows, the real-life stories of the 5 women most widely recognized as victims, the specific and genuine limitations of Victorian policing and forensic science that hampered the investigation, and the way this single, unresolved case became entangled with, and in some ways helped shape broader developments in journalism, social reform, and popular culture that extended far beyond the specific streets of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888. As we bring tonight's journey to a close, it is worth sitting for a moment with everything we have walked through together. We have traced the streets of a district shaped by poverty and resilience in equal measure. We have spoken the names of 5 women whose lives deserve to be remembered as more than the final chapter of a mystery. We have followed an investigation limited by the tools of its time, hampered by jurisdictional division, and shaped by a press eager for sensational detail. And we've sat, honestly, with the genuine and lasting uncertainty at the centre of this history, a case that has never been solved, and, by most careful historical assessments, likely never will be. There is nothing more you need to carry forward from tonight. Let the gaslit streets fade quietly into the dark. Let the old newspaper headlines settle into silence. Let the names we have spoken tonight rest gently, remembered rather than sensationalized. The history has been walked through carefully, and it is safe now to let it soften at the edges of your mind. If this slow journey through history has helped ease you towards sleep, there is another story waiting quietly on the screen whenever you are ready for it. And if these evenings of history have brought you some comfort, a like, a subscription, or a quiet comment helps others searching for the same sense of calm find their way here too. For now, let your breathing ease, let the day loosen its final grip. The old streets of Whitechapel are quiet tonight, the way they have been for well over a century, and there is nothing more this history needs from you except rest. Sleep well, and good night.